Order, please. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. This very session, Mr. Speaker, is an admission of failure by the Premier to work something out with teachers that will make our classrooms better. It will also prove to be a very expensive session for taxpayers, as the work that is before us will be challenged in the courts for years to come and cost millions. In fact, Mr. Speaker, in a memo to teachers tonight, the Nova Scotia Teachers Union has said, and I quote, "We will challenge this in the courts." I'd like to ask the Premier, why is he condemning taxpayers to millions of dollars in legal fees instead of simply putting that money to work in our classrooms?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I want to remind him that every budget that I've introduced in this House, I've continued to make more and more investments in public education. Also, I'd like to remind him that I had negotiated 3 tentative agreements with the Nova Scotia Teachers Union, 3 different executives, Mr. Speaker. They came forward. Teachers have obviously said, Mr. Speaker, they oppose that. I want to remind the honourable member that even the teachers' union lawyer has suggested that challenge this in court would be very difficult for the union, but they'll make their own decision, Mr. Speaker. We'll stand by the decisions that we've made.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, it has to be said, the Premier has had exactly 0 agreements with the teachers, Mr. Speaker. He may have had tentative agreements, but they were never ratified, meaning he's still 0 in terms of agreements. That's the problem. When you legislate a contract, when you have 0 agreements, it's going to be challenged in the courts. The Premier likes to quote the union's lawyer, Mr. Speaker. I hope he has his own legal ducks in a row. I'd like to ask him to table in this House, before the end of the day, any and all legal analysis and opinions he has to back up his claim.
Please, you're not able to ask the question to the government to table legal opinions from their counsel. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the taxpayers of Nova Scotia deserve exactly to know how much they're at risk for, and I do encourage the Premier to voluntarily provide them with the legal analysis that hopefully he has done, that he is relying on, Mr. Speaker, because without a doubt, every single taxpaying Nova Scotian would prefer that their money be spent in the classrooms and not on legal fees, Mr. Speaker. But that's not going to happen. Whether you're quoting the teachers' union lawyer or a government lawyer, Mr. Speaker, it is going to be challenged in the courts, and no matter what's decided, millions of dollars is going to be spent on legal fees, Mr. Speaker. So why does the Premier prefer to spend that money on legal fees instead of in our classroom in the first place?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to remind the honourable member that every budget that we've tabled in this House, we've invested more and more in public education. Mr. Speaker, I want to remind him that we've had 3 tentative agreements with the Nova Scotia Teachers Union. Mr. Speaker, 2 different executives. We continue to move forward. Mr. Speaker, there's one thing, though, that Nova Scotians expect our government to do, and any government to do, Mr. Speaker, is to stand up and respect all taxpayers. We believe we have on the table a fair offer for teachers, Mr. Speaker. We also believe we have an offer that absolutely allows us to invest in things like job creation, Mr. Speaker, that we've retained more young people per capita than any other Canadian province. We're seeing a huge growth in our export opportunities. Those are the kind of investments we want to make to create job opportunities here. Mr. Speaker, it's the balance that all governments have to do, and Nova Scotians have trusted our government to make sure that we represent them fairly, and we're doing so.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier also. Mr. Speaker, back in the fall, the Premier said that we all have to do our part for the solution. He told teachers the growth of your benefits has to slow down. The truth is that the Premier has one set of rules for the inner circle and another set of rules for the rest of us. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier explain to the teachers why he has no money for the public service but had an extra $23,000 for a friend, Marilla Stevenson?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, as he knows, that job, Mr. Speaker, was provided, Mr. Speaker. There was a position there that was filled by the lady that he's referring to. There was a salary associated with it. The honourable member stands in this House. He recognizes that not too long ago he was asked by his leader to be the leader in the House along came with that was an additional $23,000 to $25,000. He accepted that as part of his contract, Mr. Speaker. He's being paid for the job, Mr. Speaker, that he's doing in the House, Mr. Speaker, just like every other public servant has done, Mr. Speaker. But it's actually, Mr. Speaker, wrong for the honourable member to suggest that anyone has received an increase, Mr. Speaker. What they're doing is being paid for the job, Mr. Speaker, that they're doing.
The honourable leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, parents, students, teachers are trying to be heard with this Premier when he says he can't afford to improve classrooms' conditions. This isn't about money, it's about priorities, Mr. Speaker. Will the Premier explain to the parents why he won't agree to hire enough teachers to limit class sizes, but agree to provide the RBC with $22 million in payroll rebates?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to remind the honourable member that we've continued to invest in public education every year. Unlike a government and executive council that he was part of that cut $65 million out of public education, Mr. Speaker, continue to go forward, Mr. Speaker. There's one thing that parents and people know across this province is education is a priority. We're going to
order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, unlike the former government that he was a member
order,
of the executive.
Please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, unlike the former government that he was a member of the Executive Council that cut $65 million out of public education, we've continued to invest in public education. We've continued to listen to teachers. Teachers have made it very clear, Mr. Speaker, that their views weren't represented at the bargaining table. We have now set up a structure that they can have their views heard directly, Mr. Speaker, and we will make the implementation that teachers want us to make to improve learning in classroom environments.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Speaker, now, apparently I ran out of Snickers bars the last session, so I guess maybe a Valentine heart would be appropriate now. Mr. Speaker, there's a clear pattern here. The Premier expects students, parents and teachers to settle for less, while he gives more and more money to those that need it the least. $6.5 million to Lockheed Martin, $528,000 to CNS Accounting Solutions in the Cayman Islands, $840,000 to Butterfield Bank in Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier explain to Nova Scotians why he thinks big business, banks and people in his inner circle are more important than teachers and students?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Again, I want to thank all those teachers across the province, Mr. You continue to show up, do work, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of students across this province. Mr. Speaker, we continue to make investments in public education. There's $20 million.
Order, please. I made a comment yesterday about the heckling. I would really appreciate cooperation on that front in this particular session. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We continue to make investments in classrooms. Mr. Speaker, we have $20 million that is part of this current bill that is before the House, so we're looking forward to hearing from classroom teachers across the province on how best to spend that. There are other initiatives that are being brought forward, and we're looking forward to working with classroom teachers to improve the learning environment, Mr. Speaker, and the working conditions in classrooms across this province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Taxpayers across this province expect that their money will be spent in a fair manner, particularly when it comes to our students in schools, Mr. Speaker. That means that schools should be selected, new schools, on the basis of need, not on the basis of politics. That's why parents are so upset, Mr. Speaker, in places like Spring Hill and the Eastern Shore and other places where their schools were passed over so that a new school could be built in the Premier's riding, in the Minister of Education's riding, in the riding of Halifax Atlantic, even when their school boards didn't ask for them, Mr. Speaker. How does the Premier justify overriding school board priorities and making Liberal Party priorities more important?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. It gives me a great opportunity to stand up and talk about the great schools and the constituency that I represent. I want to remind the honourable member that the school in Bridgetown that was being committed to was actually done by the former government of the NDP, Mr. Speaker. That was announced. We're continuing to work forward to make sure that we provide that infrastructure for students across this province. Board makes their priority list. We go through those priorities, looking at need, looking at geographical preferences, Mr. Speaker. We continue to make those investments, and we'll continue to do so to make sure that that infrastructure is there for students.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the fact is the government, the Cabinet, goes through those school board priorities and then ignores them. That's why the Auditor General actually scolded the Premier and his government for the way that they ignore the recommendations of engineers, of school construction specialists, and instead rely on their own political needs, Mr. Speaker. That's what's wrong. That's what the Auditor General blew the whistle on this government for. In fact, he said he is at a loss to understand why schools in the Premier's riding and the Minister of Education's riding were approved even then, though there was no evidence of need, Mr. Speaker. Well, there's lots of communities where there is real evidence of need, and they got skipped over, Mr. Speaker, and that is not fair. How can the Premier expect teachers and students and their families to trust him to make better deals in their classrooms when he makes political deals with new schools?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would encourage the honourable member to do what I encouraged the Auditor General to do, was pick up the phone and call the school board, Mr. Speaker. They made their priorities. Mr. Speaker, when I went through, Mr. Speaker, want to know the honourable member, I actually stood with my school board members ever since I've been elected in community halls across my riding, Mr. Speaker. They've laid out priorities, Mr. Speaker, and every one of their priorities was done long before the school in Bridgetown, which was committed to by the former government. It's unfortunate that the honourable member does not know where his own riding is and won't stand with the people of his riding to make sure they're being heard.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Mr. Speaker,
Order, please. The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's. Order, please. The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Mr. Speaker, my question's to the Premier, and I have a school board that did not have a school on the list. The Halifax Regional School Board was asked to provide the government with a list of priorities for capital investment. The board voted to support requests for a replacement school for Highland Park Junior High, and a major alteration and repair of St. Joseph's A. McKay School. A motion to add a request for a new school or major alteration for J.L. Isley was voted down by the board. However, the government proudly announced a new building. Yes, Mr. Speaker, there is. And that question is, can the Premier explain why his government chose not to follow the recommendations of the Halifax Regional School Board?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, as she knows, school boards send in capital instruction across the province. The board, as she would know, as a member of the former executive council, has a certain amount of capital infrastructure. The decisions are made based on geographical issues, need, and all of the things that are associated. There's always more work to do than there is money to do it, Mr. Speaker. We're continuing to make sure that we improve the school infrastructure across our province, and will continue to do so in the years to come.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Education continually always says in this House, it's not up to her, it's up to the school board. So why is it different this time? So, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, has this just been a reward for the member for Halifax Atlantic to vote for Bill 75?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure how the honourable member and her former premier conducted themselves, Mr. Speaker, but her motive. And I know the honourable member, and I know, Mr. Speaker, someone wrote that question for her, because I know there's no way. I know there's no way she would say that in this House, Mr. Speaker. But I do want to say this: that the honourable member. Represents Atlantic, Mr. Speaker, continues to be proud of his community of Spryfield, has continued to defend and build on the legacy, Mr. Speaker, Bill Estabrooks, who was in here talking about that school, and former members who are in this House talking about that particular school and the need for replacement, Mr. Speaker. Continue to make that voice being heard. But I want to again tell the honourable member, we go through the issue of making sure that school infrastructure is brought in by school boards all across the province. We need to look at geographical issues, all of those things associated with, Mr. Speaker. Decisions are made. I realize not every community is happy, but we'll continue to work with communities to make sure we deal with that infrastructure.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question to you is to the Minister of Education. During a scrum a few weeks ago and then reported on Radio Canada, the minister told reporters her department was looking, because of the overcrowding at CSA Metro schools, was looking at mixing French and English schools, maybe combining them. In the Doucette Boudreau versus Nova Scotia, the Supreme Court upheld the decision of Monsieur Arthur Leblanc of the Nova Scotia Supreme Court, who ordered the province to speed up its plans to build French language high schools or to convert mixed language schools to French only. And I can table that information. It's unconstitutional to mix French-speaking schools with English ones. So my question to the minister is, will she admit that she made a mistake in suggesting that we mix French and English schools?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Any decision about where the students from CSAP would go would be a decision of the CSAP board.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Wow. As I said, during a scrum, the minister made this statement, and it was reported on CBC. So the minister made the statement that in order to try to alleviate some of the overcrowding in some of the CSAP schools, that maybe there'd be a way to mix these schools into English ones. And the minister knows full well that this is unconstitutional. In 2003, Acadian parents fought hard to ensure children's rights were being protected. In Section 24 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms requires governments to ensure compliance with minority language education rights by securing 23 of the Charter. The Supreme Court judge found that the province, in violation of Section 23, and perhaps the Minister of Acadian Affairs, could counsel the Minister of Education on the rights of Acadians. So my question to the minister is, does the minister understand the expensive consequences of statements like mixing French and English schools?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Don't laugh. You're going to stop laughing at this stuff. You know how important this is?
Order, please.
Really?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I certainly remember the conversation. I know exactly what I said. There were certainly opportunities with the two different boards to work together to try to resolve some of the overcrowding and need for school spaces in communities where the French schools and the English schools were close by. And my deputy was asked, I asked my deputy to speak to the superintendents of both of those boards to see if there was any interest in working together. I have said, and I will say again, any decision that CSAP board would make would be their decision, but the conversation needed to be had, and I'm awaiting the results of that.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Education also. Teachers told the government many times they would like to see changes made to the practice of not failing students. As things stand now, too many children are moving forward who do not meet the expected learning outcomes of their current grade level. Parents ultimately have the final say, and 9 times out of 10 they make the decision to keep their child with their age-appropriate group rather than their skill level. And I'll table that document, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the Minister is, why did the Minister wait until today to address this long-standing problem?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure what the member means by a long-standing problem. There has been a belief in the province that there was a no-fail policy. There was never a no-fail policy. The decision about placement and retention of students is made at the school level in consultation with the parent, the classroom teacher, and the principal. So when people were using this as perhaps a way to deflect the responsibility to somebody else, we needed to make sure that everybody understood it. There is no no-fail policy.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, it's common sense that students must meet all expected learning outcomes to grade the level they're in to be considered for the next grade level. With this change, there will be fewer students who struggle, who would require extra help and tailored learning programs. Teachers should have the authority to determine if a student should pass or fail. In her comments today, the Minister said that the principal has the final say in who passes and fails. Will the Minister guarantee that teachers will be empowered to make these decisions?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Teachers, parents, and the principal are all involved in any decisions about placement or retention of students. There is no change. That has always been, and that it will continue. The statement about that there was no no-fail policy was to try to dispel the myth that some people have that there is one, and there is not. The responsibility is still with the parent, the teacher, and the principal.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday in the technical briefing on Bill 75, the Minister of Education asked, how long do you have to continue negotiating? Well, I would think that the answer to that would be obvious. You continue negotiating until you've reached an agreement. You don't take your toys and go home. So, Mr. Speaker, can the minister please explain to Nova Scotians why she abandoned the collective bargaining process?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's been made very clear on many occasions that the two sides worked very hard. Both sides brought ideas and solutions to the table. I commend the negotiating teams on both sides. They worked over 15 months. They came up with 3 tentative agreements, all approved and supported by the provincial executive and recommended by the executive that the membership would support them. They did not. And so after the 3rd tentative deal was not ratified by the membership, the decision was made that there would be very little opportunity for any further tentative deals to be reached.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for that answer. However, she has said that 40% of teachers accepted the first tentative agreement, and 40% is less than 60%, Mr. Speaker, and it's certainly not a majority. So perhaps she could explain why she thinks it's reasonable to impose a contract on teachers that they've already firmly rejected.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can repeat what I just said, or I can say that we had three tentative deals, all recommended for ratification by the membership. In all of those cases, the membership said no, and after 15 months and no resolution, it appeared that the disruption that was happening in our schools with work to rule needed to be put to an end, and that's why we're here today.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this evening, the Minister of Education talked about a code of conduct that she felt should allow teachers to deal with cases of violence against students and teachers across the province. And yet, Guidance Councillor Judy Hutchinson writes that every day in this province there are teachers who are hit, spit on, kicked, punched, and have things thrown at them by students, often with no consequences. So the question for the Minister is, if the code of conduct is such a great solution, then why is it not being enforced or implemented in the way she thinks it should be?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When we were hearing from different schools and different school boards about the way that inappropriate behavior was being addressed, it became obvious that each board had their own code of conduct. Some schools had their own, and in order to bring some consistency, we put together provincial code of conduct which brings that consistency, and it is out in all the school boards. It is to be implemented, and there certainly are provisions in that to deal with the situations that the member is raising.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Speaker, the issue appears to be that it's not. As well, Section 70 of the Education Act, which makes it an offence to be threatening or abusive or to even swear in classrooms, is also not being enforced. This year, in a Yarmouth area school, a teacher, 8 months pregnant, was kicked in the stomach, missed 2.5 days of school, and yet the student was back in the class that afternoon. Last week, teacher assistants in another school in the Yarmouth area were told to wear shin guards because students were kicking them. At a CSAP school in Dartmouth, a class there is emptied on a regular basis at least once a week because of a violent student, and yet the student remains, and the violence and the students and teachers suffer with no consequences. Mr. Speaker, the Minister has seen these and many other examples because she's been copied on the emails.
Does the member have a question?
Is this the code of why is the code of conduct not solving these issues, and why are they still happening?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I would say that any of these situations that the member has raised are certainly unacceptable. It's not something that we would ever want happening in our schools. The Code of Conduct was designed to protect and to ensure the safety of all of the students and all of the workers, employees in a school. There certainly was an opportunity in the Code of Conduct. We extended the amount of time that a principal could suspend a student from 5 days to 10. Principals were asking for that, and they now have the tools that they need to try to address the actions that the member describes.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, teachers, students, parents and others interested in Nova Scotia's education system want to voice their opinions about the bill introduced by the Minister of Education last night. And Mr. Speaker, our system allows them to do that at the Standing Committee on Law Amendments. So my question to the Minister is quite simple. Will the Minister, as Chair of the Law Amendments Committee, guarantee that everyone who asks to be heard by the committee will have their say?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity to answer a question and speak to you today. I don't think any of the other ministers expected to be asked one today, so it's a nice break. The Law Amendments Committee, as the members pointed out, is an essential and very important part of our process. We have law amendments each time an act goes through, and we certainly are looking into the arrangements for this particular bill as it moves through the legislature.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister for that answer. Mr. Speaker, recently the government did the right thing by offering many options to Nova Scotians to express their opinions about Bill 59. Providing video conferencing on bills allows Nova Scotians from all across our province to take part in the democratic process that we hold so dear. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister, will the Minister be providing the same access to a Law Amendments Committee for Bill 75 as she did for Bill 59?
Order, please. I'm going to disallow that question and the previous question, as the clerk so aptly pointed out and confirmed my thought. We're not allowed to ask information about proceedings of a committee that has not yet made its report to the House. I realize that, but I was thinking about it, giving you the benefit of the doubt. The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. In 2013, while in opposition, the Minister of Labour took issue with the NDP government's record on collective bargaining. She introduced a resolution in the House saying that the NDP's imposition of a contract should require them to strike their collective bargaining record from their list of accomplishments. Does the Minister still feel so passionately about touting collective bargaining successes as an accomplishment, and what does she say about her own government's record now that she's the Minister of Labour?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. It's interesting that we're all looking back on the things that we held so dear, and I would point out that as Minister of Labour, I don't comment on what either side does in any negotiation. Thank you.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, at the time the Minister made these comments in the House, the Liberal caucus was singing a very different tune about labour relations and the right to fair negotiations. That quickly went out the window, and the people that the government has made the most negative impact on has been our students. My question as a Minister of not only Labour but Advanced Education, has the Minister spoken up on behalf of the students with her Cabinet colleagues?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
As the honourable member probably knows, because I've made it quite clear, when this particular issue is discussed in Cabinet, I do not participate. I leave the room. Thank you.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development. Throughout the negotiation process of the NSTU has kept parents informed and given them time to plan. On the other hand, the government seems to have been quite happy to create chaos and let parents pay the price. Documents obtained by the NDP caucus through a Freedom of Information request show that the department was preparing for a province-wide shutdown as early as November 28th of their schools, but gave parents less than 48 hours notice. So would the minister please explain to Nova Scotians when the decision was made to close the schools?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I think it would be safe to say that this government and this department and this minister care about the kids in our schools. And when we understand that we're in negotiations and there is the potential for that delivery of the program to be interrupted, we do have to be prepared.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the government chose to close schools for the day, parents were left scrambling for childcare. Emails show that the department was not willing to provide additional funding to childcare centres for the anticipated closure and was well aware that any extra funding would come from parents' fees, not grants. So, Mr. Speaker, would the minister apologize to parents for making them pay for the government's mistakes?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think in fairness to the department, we certainly wanted to make sure that parents had advance notice if there was going to be a time when their students would not be in the schools. We gave them that advance notice, and I respect that decision that was made at the department, and I support it.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. A number of emails I have received from teachers have mentioned the difficulty of teaching students diagnosed with ADHD. One email, which I'll table, is from a mother whose daughter teaches grade 3. 5 of the students in the class have been diagnosed with ADD or ADHD, one undiagnosed ADD, one autistic student, 2 with behavioral issues, that in a class of 26. My question for the Minister is, what is her department doing to address ADHD and other types of learning challenges that teachers face every day?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we recognize that there are many different challenges that students have in the classrooms. The complexities in the classroom is one of the things that teachers have asked us to consider and to look at. When we were meeting with teachers and when teachers were writing to me, we recognize that that is something that has to be addressed. We know that there are children who bring issues to the classroom that need support, and we are working with the Department of Health, in particular Dr. Stan Kuchar, in order to provide the right resources so that teachers have the professional development they need and the resources that will allow them to respond to those children's needs.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
I'd like to thank the Minister for that answer. Teachers tell me that things have really gotten worse in the last 3 or 4 years, and one change seems to be that there are less EAs available in class. In fact, one teacher told me that even severely developmentally delayed students will not have an EA if they are nonviolent. My question for the Minister is this. Given that it's clear that having an EA in a classroom can make a huge difference, can the Minister tell this House what plans she has to address this EA shortage?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's no question that there are more children requiring more supports in our schools, in our classrooms. The boards are given their funding for through the special ed funding grant. Out of that, they do provide supports through EAs. They also look at where those needs are, how they can best respond to those needs, and the schools certainly let their central office staff know that they have a need and a need for an EA. Are there ever enough? I don't believe there ever are enough, but that's certainly something that when we're looking at our inclusion report by the Commission on Inclusion, we may find that that is the best response. However, I think it's folly to put money into EAs if that's not the best solution.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Business. Mr. Speaker, there's a large plant empty in the town of Trenton in Pittsburgh County, and recently, a few weeks ago, the Minister notified interested parties that there was some action being taken. There was a bid accepted by PricewaterhouseCoopers. Mr. Speaker, would the Minister give the House an update with regard to what is happening now since that a few weeks ago with regard to lease to own, to operate, etc.?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. I've had discussions in the past with my colleague relative to the status of the DSTM facility in Trenton. As he shared with the House, there is presently a conditional bid on the property. That process is presently in the hands of the receiver, and we are awaiting feedback from the receiver on the developments in negotiations with that particular proponent.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my next question to the Minister is with regard to the type of operation that may end up in this particular plant and the projection for the number of employees in the first year of operation.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Those circumstances aren't part of public discussion at this time. The proponent has asked that those circumstances remain confidential during the negotiation period. The proponent is more than prepared, once the receivership sale is approved by the courts, to attend the community and to share with the community what their objectives are and the specific focus that they have in mind.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is also for the Minister of Justice. There are undoubtedly many Nova Scotians concerned that the government's attempt to end this dispute with teachers will result in lengthy litigation that will drive an even greater wedge between teachers and the government and also cost taxpayers a substantial amount of money. So I ask the Minister, what assurances can she give Nova Scotians that this bill will not result in a long, drawn-out court battle that pits the teachers of this province against their own government?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, and I do appreciate the question from the honourable member. In terms of assurances about what will happen, none of us can say what will happen, but I can assure the members opposite that the drafting of this bill was done with great care and that we believe that it is legal and will stand the test of time, but only, as I say, only the future will tell us for sure.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, in November of last year, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled in favour of the British Columbia Teachers Federation after a lengthy battle with the BC government that lasted over a decade. At issue in that case was whether a provincial government can legislate away parts of the collective agreement it signed with public sector unions. That precedent does not seem to bode well for this government's current approach to ending this dispute. So I ask the Minister, why does she think this government's decision to impose an agreement on teachers in Nova Scotia will not suffer the same fate as the actions of the government of British Columbia?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I would just say to the member opposite that there are two very different issues. There is nothing in this current bill that legislates away current, nothing that's in a contract is being taken away. So let me put it that way. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education. When the Minister of Finance announced that a new school to replace J.L. Ilsley had been approved, parents and students on the Eastern Shore were shocked. Eastern Shore District High School has no potable water, contains asbestos, and has serious sewage problems. That school, built in 1965, was listed by the Halifax Regional School Board as a priority for a new school or an addition or alteration. It was not lost on the Eastern Shore parents that J.L. Ilsley was not on the school board list. I asked the Minister, what does the Minister say to the parents of the Eastern Shore about why a school with no drinking water and asbestos got passed over, but a school not recommended by the school board will be built in Halifax Atlantic?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are a number of factors that are considered when decisions are made about where schools will be built, and they certainly include the needs of the students, the recommendations from the school board, the capital money that's available for that during that particular year, the amount of money that has already been invested in a school, the concerns about the needs of the school. There are a whole host of things that are considered, and the same consideration will be given for Eastern Shore as was given to Ilsley, as given to any new school.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No potable water, serious sewage issues. I would think that health and safety of students would be a consideration. But yet the school board itself didn't ask for a school in J.L. Ilse. They pointed to this school over here and said, this is where we want a new school. This is where we need one. And this cabinet overruled that and said, well, we'll stick one in Halifax Atlantic. We might as well put one in the Premier's area too, and maybe the Minister's as well. So we're looking at a situation. It costs about 50 grand a year to have drinking water trucked to the Eastern Shore District High School. That's probably why the Halifax School Board wanted a school there. So my question for the Minister is, in 2017, is it acceptable for one school not to have drinking water while a school that was not determined to be needed by a school board is built anyway?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The issue of water is certainly an issue in that particular school. The safety of the students and the safety of the staff is priority. That's why they are bringing water in so that it is safe for that school. And as we would do in any school, we want to make sure that every student and every user of that school, whether it's teacher, parent, or any other adult, is safe. And so the issue with the water is certainly something that the board is looking after.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Health was looking a little too at ease here, so I thought I'd ask him a question and keep him up this late hour. So it's been a year, or a little over a year actually, since the government promised to consult with seniors about their bungled seniors pharmacy care changes. They promised the consultations would be starting months and months ago, and yet there has been no word. So, Mr. Speaker, I wonder if I could ask him the question of when will the consultations begin and where will they be held?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. This is a very, very important file for our seniors, and getting it done right and making sure that the comprehensive approach is used, both in terms of survey, direct consultation with seniors, input obviously from the group of 9, and that work is now in progress.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
So what I heard there, Mr. Speaker, was soon, very soon, not too sure. Aside from the unfair increases of last year's program, another concern for seniors at the time was the lack of time to plan for those changes. So yet again, many seniors have already mapped out their budgets for the year and would like two things from government: to be consulted and maybe to be warned of any changes that are coming up. Will changes to the pharmacare plan be included in the 2017-2018 budget?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to say that for the fiscal year 2017-2018, there will be no changes to senior pharmacare, and consultations are certainly going to be a robust part of making sure that this is right, not just for next year, but for the next decade.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, this government wants people to believe they are concerned about the welfare of students. It was this government that locked students out of classrooms when teachers were ready to teach. The actions of this government caused the largest student walkout this province has seen. Mr. Speaker, was the Premier prioritizing student needs when he locked them out of their classrooms?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, if we go back to the Friday before, Mr. Speaker, 8 superintendents across the province said that they could not guarantee kids' safety. Mr. Speaker, if I had not acted, that honourable member would have stood in her place and accused me of not protecting kids, Mr. Speaker. What we did is we went to the union. The union would not guarantee us. We went, Mr. Speaker, we announced what we would be doing, and on that Monday, the union sent a directive and told the principals they expect them to ensure that the places are safe. We were fine with that, Mr. Speaker, and here we are today.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, on December 5th, when the government closed schools and threatened to bring in legislation, the MLA for Waverley Fall River Beaver Bank told reporters he didn't like the way things were going. Mr. Speaker, is the Premier confident that the MLA for Waverley Fall River Beaver Bank feels better about how things are going now?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I would hope the honourable member across the way would not want to make sure the kids were unsafe in schools. Mr. Speaker, no wonder he's uneasy about it, as we were as well. Mr. Speaker, when the issue became clarified, we moved back to where teachers began to do the work to rule. We were back at the bargaining table looking for an agreement for the third time, Mr. Speaker. We had an agreement with the executive of the Nova Scotia Teachers Union that was rejected, and we now know this work to rule is impacting the education, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're here today.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Health and Wellness. During the fall session, I stood up and I spoke about a constituent of mine, a young lady who was battling cancer. And it was a heartfelt story. And the minister stood up and indicated that she would have a doctor, and I was thrilled. In fact, later that day during late debate, I said, good things happen here. You know, something good happened here today. The minister has promised this individual a doctor, and we still do not have a doctor. No. She still does not have a doctor. After about a dozen calls with the department, she still does not have a doctor. I'm wondering if the minister can tell me what happened.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and certainly we reached out as well to the constituent, and we have been working to red flagged, if you wish, to have a doctor for her. We have to put that operational matter in the hands of the health authority. We have to rely on them to expedite that when asked, and it is unfortunate that it has not been accomplished to date.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the minister for his answer. What I would like to see happen is a phone call made to her to apologize, and maybe even a press release to tell all Nova Scotians, it doesn't matter if you're dying, you cannot get a doctor, because the Department of Health cannot dictate to any doctor by law that they have to take on a patient. So it's up to us as MLAs to beg, ask for favors from our doctor friends to take these patients on. So I want to know, what will the minister do? I want to promise that he'll call her and apologize, and I would like a press release saying the department cannot help you find a doctor. End of story.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And actually, within the question is the answer, in the sense that no doctor can be told to take on a particular patient, or how many patients, how many hours. That is all within their prerogative, but certainly we will continue. We will continue to work on behalf of her and all Nova Scotians to provide doctors.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier seems to like regurgitating the same mantra, that his government negotiated 3 tentative agreements with 2 NSTU executives, that 40% of teachers accepted the first tentative agreement, and then he likes to throw the NDP under the same bus as the union and teachers by saying that we cut $65 million from education. So, Mr. Speaker, I would love the Premier to please table the proof of that $65 million cuts, where it was, and I'd also like him to table the $65 million he keeps claiming that he has put back into the education department. Thank you.
Premier.
Speaker, I want the honourable member to go to classrooms across this province. She'll see the proof of the cuts, Mr. Speaker, that we've been restoring for the last 3 years.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, teachers are telling me that they don't see where this $65 million is going, and we know that it was cost pressures added to a $13 million cut. That is not an actual cut, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to see the proof of that instead of just keep hearing the hyperbole over and over and over again. The propaganda propaganda, Mr. Speaker, the fake news, the alternative facts. So, Mr. Speaker, I would like him to table that tomorrow. Thank you very much, and also the proof of the $65 million being put back into the system. We know $44 million of it came from the early years being sent to the Education Department.
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. She couldn't read our budget any better than she could read the NDP budget, Mr. Speaker. It's why she quietly sat on this side of the House where they took $65 million out of classrooms from one end of this province to the other, Mr. Speaker. I want to tell the honourable member I've heard from teachers as well who said they've had having a hard time understanding where that funding has gone into their classrooms, Mr. Speaker. There's class caps. We realize there are still more issues. That's why we have $20 million on the table. It's why teachers have said their voices were not heard and why they rejected the current agreements, Mr. Speaker. They want to be at the table. We have place for 9 teachers across this province. I hope the honourable member will support this piece of legislation so that teachers can get to the table, Mr. Speaker, and tell us exactly what it is they want in their classroom.
The Honourable House Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thought I'd ask about Wedgeport.
Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to opposition business. The Opposition House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can you call private members' public bills for a second reading?
Now call private members' public bills for second reading.
Can you call Bill number 76, student performance?
Now call Bill number 76, student performance. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When we tabled this bill earlier today, actually yesterday, Mr. Speaker, when we tabled it yesterday, we had no idea the importance that it would take on by this time this morning, Mr. Speaker. The bill in its simplest form requires that a student must meet all expected learning outcomes appropriate to that student's grade level and meet acceptable behavioral standards in order